The word function gets thrown around a lot in algebra class, but it can often catch you off guard. Wait, what? Function? Where did that come from? Well, the reason math teachers use it so much, and often don't even realize they're doing it, is that the word function is really just a fancy word for equation or rule. A function is something you plug one thing into and get another thing out. There are actually functions all around you. If you take tests, there is a function that tells you if you get this score on your test, you will get this grade. If you go grocery shopping, there's a function that tells you if you buy this many bottles of water, you need to pay this much money. Or if you pay for cable TV, there's a function that tells you if you want this many channels, you need to pay this much money. Well, a function doesn't necessarily have to use numbers. This is a math class, so the rest of the examples we'll look at will involve numbers. Like these, for example, x squared plus 1 and 3 times x minus 1. So we've got two functions, or rules, or equations. But it's nice having names for these functions so we can be clear about which one we're talking about. The two most common names for mathematical functions are f and g. Let's name this one f and this other one g. What do we do with functions? We plug numbers into them and see what pops out. When we plug, say, 5 into the f function, we'd get 26 out. Or if we plugged -2 into the g function, we'd get -9 out. As you can see, we've got inputs and outputs. In most areas of math, we use x for the inputs and y for the outputs. But functions are a little bit different. If we just said we plugged in x equals 5 and got out y equals 26, it's not obvious which function we used to get that. Now, it probably wouldn't be too hard to figure out, but it would be nice if it was obvious. Also, just looking at the output, y equals 26, doesn't give us any clues about what we plugged in to begin with to get that number. So mathematicians came up with a different way of writing the outputs to make these things more informative. Now, this does make it more confusing at first, but once you get it, it's actually pretty helpful. Okay, so instead of calling the outputs y, the outputs from the f function will be called f of x, and the outputs from the g function will be called g of x. Notice that I'm saying f of x or g of x. I'm not saying f times x. It can be easy to see the parentheses and think multiply, but if it's an f or a g, resist the urge. Now, when we plug 5 into the f function, instead of saying y equals 26, we say f of 5 equals 26. This tells us that we used the f function and 5 was our input. Much more informative. By this same logic, g of -2 is -9. Also, now instead of having to say the f function is x squared plus 1 and the g function is 3 times x minus 1, we can simply write f of x equals x squared plus 1 and g of x equals 3 times x minus 1. Again, these are basically the same as y equals, so if you see an f of x and get freaked out, don't worry, it's basically just a y. This way of writing f of x or g of x instead of y is called function notation and is going to be used throughout math and science classes from now on. Before we finish, I have to clarify one thing I said earlier. When I said that a function was just another way of saying equation or rule, I wasn't being entirely honest. The reason is that functions are a special breed of equation. Not every equation gets to be a function. There's a test you have to pass first. In order to illustrate what that test is, I'm going to use an analogy. Let's say we've got a soda machine. It could be called a function, right? I mean, you push the button telling you what kind of soda you want, the input, and then it spits one out, the output. All right, well, for lack of a better word, let's say this is a slurp machine. It has 3 buttons on top that will all give you regular slurp, 2 buttons for diet slurp, 1 for Dr. Slurp, 1 for extreme slurp,